After all, I followed the answer which guided me to sleep next to Chloe, because it was the remedy to all evil, to all thought, to all doubt, to all worries. I desired to be close to her, and well, I was. So I indulged in the moment and let time do its thing. Chloe, on her side, alternated between closing her eyes and looking into mine, but all the time she held my hand beneath the blanket. After a while, I saw that the time had come at which we slowly ought to go to sleep, but on my side of the room, the lights were still on. So I resolved my hand slowly from hers and came forth from under the blanket to extinguish the light. But even though I was silent and light as a feather, I heard Chloe behind me almost begging me, "Stay." I turned around and shared my plan to only hit the lights and then returning afterwards. And so I did. In 90% darkness, I made my way back to her bed. The moon outside showed me the way and shone straight onto Chloe's bed. During a silhouette-like movement, I perceived her preparing the blanket for me once more. Honestly, if I hadn't been in love with her already, I would have been at the latest then. But anyway, I returned to the same space where I was laying minutes before and enjoyed the silence for a bit further. Since the lights were gone and it's supposedly very late, I intended on closing my eyes to sleep. The exact thing I estimated Chloe already doing, as I perceived not the slightest movement from her side. So I applied my breath technique, which facilitated to lose consciousness in not more than 15 minutes, and tried to calm my mind in order for the technique to work properly. But that was when something unforeseen occurred. Chloe, who was estimated half a meter away from me, suddenly came closer until she faintly touched me. At first, I was creeped out, since my technique was very efficient, and due to that, I had already lost the control over my body halfway when she made the sudden approach. As a consequence, I rapidly found back to my normal awareness and felt that she pressed herself against me, but not like a friendly hug, rather as if it was our last night forever. Without exaggeration, she almost strangled me while she wrapped her arms around my throat. Luckily, she couldn't maintain that kind of pressure for too long and retired to a more usual way of hugging. Although it was still the embrace of a heavyweight fighter, I managed to inhale at least a little bit of air, so I wasn't that close to suffocating anymore. After I had put my survival instinct to sleep, I had then the question what all that was about. I mean, that hug was not enough. I also felt something moistening my nightgown and the pillow I was laying on. But without too much interpretation, I raised my arms in a reflex and laid them on her back, where I pushed her a little bit closer into my direction. And thus, there was not the slightest space between us anymore. It felt as if we were one, two people in one giant biological vessel. Hard to describe, but what I knew was that it alluded perfectly to my thesis of that us faith. Anyway, as she confronted me with that situation, I had to tear myself together to not also burst into tears, as it was another contagious aspect of her, except for her smile, which represented the other polarity, so to say. I just held her further in my arms, and she held me in hers, without losing grip for even 1 second. I could speak for both when I said we didn't sleep for the next 2 hours. Even when those tear torrents of hers had run dry, I waited for my shirt to do the same. And for she unleashed massive surges of inexplicable sadness onto me. It took a while until the cloth wasn't damp anymore. During that time, I additionally could gain certainty that those waves had flattened out, so more or less both of us were able to sleep under calm conditions. Because not much later, I completely lost myself. I couldn't tell whether Chloe was already asleep, but the following morning, when I woke up, she was, however. Like the day before, I was shaken up by the door cracking open. But the fact someone entered our room and probably saw us laying together in one bed was only of secondary significance, as all my attention was directed on Chloe, who was still in that pose as she approached me last night. Neither she nor I had moved, and that changed only as whoever was entering stood right in front of us. I scratched my eyes to see who it was. Until then, I was solely depending on my non-visual senses. So I didn't see Chloe being there, but I rather felt her. It sounds off, but my fear to get caught with Chloe right beside me was gone. I didn't care too much about which caretaker would visit us, or even the doctor himself. The only matter in my head was the two matters, which actually appeared to have merged into one, and nothing else. As I prepared my eyes to look at our visitor, I also heard her speech. If I had put my money on that picture I'm seeing now, I wouldn't have to work here anymore. Guys, at least be a little bit careful when you do that. I mean, it is not a hotel. Hotel. Hospital. Hospital. It sounds quite similar, I admit. But please, for your own sake, and for the sake of the nurse who has to wake you up. You truly had luck that I reckoned with that. So I changed my shift with Sarah's, who would have been here in my stead. And she is new. So the last thing she'd do is turning a blind eye to that. In the meantime, she unwittingly woke up Chloe, who also rubbed her eyes, like I did previously. Then she even adjusted her gaze to mine, while then both of us just stared at Jessica, expecting something to happen. Alright. Mrs. Mole is also wandering amongst the living again. So what I wanted to say, just be aware that some people are not as tolerant as I am. So, anyway, may I beg your willingness to come with me, please? Chloe stretched herself as a consequence, before she ultimately stood up and followed her. Against all apprehensions, Jessica gave me a mild gaze of confirmation when she left, which told me that although there was a lot of risk involved, I acted corresponding to the favor of everyone, even though it was certainly a thing between Chloe and me only, wasn't it? I mean, I was about to say that I officially had a girlfriend then. That night broke down my barriers of doubt and skepticism, so that I had no choice to avoid that term. We were together on so many levels, so why not also in a relationship? Although I described comprehensively what I think about those descriptions, I really saw it match with what is termed a boyfriend-girlfriend connection. Anyway, even though I could have looked through those rose-colored glasses for several hours more, I had to consider the following day, the day of my departure, which kind of shattered that rosy view of mine. Yes, everything went fine until then, even more than that. We managed to establish a bond between us, which usually needs months or sometimes even years to thrive up to that point. We only needed 1 week approximately, but contrary to that, we were about to enter a period of separation, and my fear regarding that said simply that it could tear us apart. When I thought about those long-range relationships that just break apart sometimes, I saw myself in a similar situation. After all, I had now a period of hard schoolwork and only a little free space to visit. Additionally, we're talking about several kilometers I had to drive to that hospital and also return to my home. Well, it's difficult indeed, but not impossible. My view on that term impossible was heavily distorted either way, so the chance for it to work out in the end was not exactly 0%. The happy ending was quite far away, I had to admit, but I intended to contribute anything I had to that relationship, because I was far beyond the point I could just press the forget now button. And concluding, when such a relationship, even one in general, breaks down, it happens for a reason. Maybe one partner didn't appreciate it truly, or the other just escaped because of another reason, or even for another lover. I don't know. But as long as we preserve the keys like honesty, trust, and that us faith, it will spare us from ending up like those in the explained worst case scenarios. Be that as it may, for that moment though, I had to consider the certainty laying right in the close future. The school didn't sleep, so that it was the next thing I had to engage with. And cohesive was my task then, to wrap up everything and prepare myself for the following day of my release. Even if I rather had stayed there a little bit longer, but as Jessica said, it is not a hotel, so there we go. Luckily, my parents left me such a sports bag when they visited me recently, into which I could pack all my clothes and other things. Once, the pile of clothes I had inside my cupboard, consisting of mainly underwear. Only recently, before they announced my departure, I wore normal clothes, whereas prior to that, I only had that compulsory clothing, that shirt or nightgown, or however they refer to that. Chloe instead always wore that. Maybe it was due to those treatments she had to endure daily. Probably one of those mysteries I would take back home with me. However, the other half of my stuff consisted of the things my parents brought me from time to time. For example, my smartphone and those cards which wished me betterment and so on. Most of that stuff was already in the little bag which they delivered me shortly after I found myself inside the hospital. So I took the bag into my hands to investigate if everything was still the way it should be and laid it into the sports bag. But right as a consequence, I grabbed it out once more because I had a brilliant, spontaneous idea. An idea I could only realize the day after, or at the earliest, that evening. My long-term intention was to be together with Chloe somehow, even though not physically always. Particularly in those first days, it would be vital to do that. I just wanted her to know that I really wanted to be with her. And for that purpose, I arranged something like a bail of some sort. A sign to her that I would come back as soon as possible. On one side, I had fulfilled that thought through that brilliant idea I had before, which was one thing. The other already was deposited on her bedside table. We hadn't used it, so it was still untouched since the evening before yesterday. I'm talking about the Uno card game, which basically stood for the initiation of that bond between us. It was the fundamental thing that brought us together, and therefore I saw it as a substantial sign to stay that way. The only thing I wanted to avoid was a misconception according to which she saw it as a departure for good. But that was a matter I had to confront her with again on the last day or last morning. The evening before showed me clearly that there was something between us that needed to be spoken about. Her reaction, although it was the cutest thing I have ever experienced for real, was based on something inhibiting her. And therefore it was not only love, but also fear. Fear of something I didn't know anything about. Just as I had a lack of information referring to so many other things. Actually a strange side of me to play that game with her, but as I told not only once, when I interacted with her, any worry or concern suddenly disappeared. But nevertheless, it was something I undoubtedly planned to mention later on. Like the question if she knew anything about her date of release. After all, that would have been a promising solution for that long-term relationship apprehension. But either way, where problems were also solutions. We only had to find them.